The Portrait of Rhoda by Lucy Norris. "Oh, Sarah, it's beautiful," chorused Laura and Irene Edwards, gazing with wide-eyed admiration at the roomy four-poster bed with its dainty silken drapes. "Are we really going to sleep in it tonight?" Lorna and Irene were identical twins and often spoke in unison. Sarah Parker smiled fondly at them. "But of course you are," she confirmed. "When I invite my best friends home for Christmas, I try to grant their every wish. You said you wanted to sleep in a four-poster, and so you shall." "Good old Sarah," said Lorna, giving her a pat on the back. "We really are grateful to you. When Mummy fell ill, we faced the prospect of a dreary Christmas with Aunt Edna. Instead, here we are, living in the lap of luxury." She swept her hand around the room. "I know you told us you lived in a family mansion, but we didn't expect anything as fantastic as this." "It is a lovely old house, isn't it?" said Sarah with justifiable pride. "It was built by my great-great-grandfather, Mortimer Parker, and Parkers have lived here ever since. My father was born in that bed." "How romantic," sighed the twins. Sarah glanced at her wristwatch. "Good, it's tea time. I'm starving. Come on, you two. I smell crumpets cooking. Lovely, lovely crumpets with oodles of butter and honey." "You're supposed to be on a diet," Lorna reminded her as Sarah led the way down to the lounge. "You boasted to Avril Sinclair you would lose half a stone in weight before next term." "I know I did," admitted Sarah, "but I wasn't feeling hungry at the time." She sighed enviously. "You two don't know how lucky you are to be slim." "We wouldn't be if we ate as much as you do," said Irene bluntly, but not unkindly. "I'll be your conscience for the next 3 weeks, Sarah. Every time you start to overeat, I will stop you. Agreed?" Sarah looked down at her plump figure and then at Irene's slim one. "Agreed," she said, with misgivings, as she led them into the lounge where her mother was waiting to serve them tea in front of a roaring log fire. Mrs. Parker welcomed them and began to hand around dainty china plates. "I'm sure you girls are hungry after your journey here." She smiled at the twins. "Lorna dear, help yourself to a crumpet, or would you prefer buttered toast?" Sarah gave a little giggle. "That's Irene, Mummy." Mrs. Parker looked from one twin to the other and shook her head. "You are so alike, I don't think I shall ever be able to tell you apart." "It's quite simple really, Mummy," laughed Sarah. "Irene puts her hair on the right, Lorna's is parted on the left. L for Lorna and L for left. And to make it even easier for you, Irene will be the one who keeps frowning and tut-tutting each time I reach for a second helping of anything." Irene certainly kept an eagle eye on Sarah. By the time they went to bed that night, Sarah was convinced she had already lost weight. Lorna awoke some hours later to find a bright beam of light shining straight into her eyes, dazzling her. Before she could call out, a hand pressed down over her mouth and a voice whispered, "It's all right, Lorna. It's only me." The hand was removed from her mouth and Lorna hissed angrily, "Really, Sarah, if this is your idea of a joke." "No, honestly, I wasn't trying to frighten you," whispered Sarah. The light from the small torch she carried threw strange shadows on her face, giving her a peculiar, grotesque expression. "What were you doing then?" Sarah raised a warning finger to her lips. "Please don't wake Irene," she pleaded. "She wouldn't understand." "Understand what?" "That I won't get a wink of sleep tonight unless I have something to eat." "But it's the middle of the night," complained Lorna. "Everyone's in bed asleep." "I know that," nodded Sarah. "That's why I want you to come down to the kitchen with me. I'm too scared to go alone. Be a sport, Lorna. I'd do the same for you." Lorna was about to refuse when she remembered that if it hadn't been for Sarah's kindness, she and her sister would be spending a miserable Christmas with Aunt Edna. "Oh, all right," she agreed, slipping silently out of bed to avoid waking Irene. Pulling on her dressing gown, she tiptoed after a jubilant Sarah. They made their way by the light of the torch, but once downstairs, Sarah switched on the hall light, and together the girls ran along to the kitchen. It wasn't until Lorna stepped onto the cold kitchen floor that she realised she had forgotten to put on her slippers. "Do hurry up," she pleaded, as Sarah rummaged through a large cupboard, opening a variety of tins. "My feet are frozen. What are you looking for, anyway?" "That chocolate fudge cake Irene wouldn't let me have at tea time," replied Sarah, licking her lips in anticipation. Lorna hopped from one foot to the other. "A plain biscuit would be less fattening," she said reprovingly. "I dread to think what Irene will say when you tell her you've been guzzling a cake in the middle of the night." "I have no intention of telling her," replied Sarah. She wrenched the lid from yet another tin. "Aha! Success at last. Like a piece?" "No, I wouldn't. And please hurry, I'm cold." Sarah found a knife and helped herself to a slice of the cake. "Sure you won't have some?" she inquired before putting the tin away. "Quite sure," Lorna said firmly. Her eyes widened as she caught sight of the generous slice Sarah was holding. "If you eat that, you'll not only get fatter, but you'll come out in spots as well," she warned. "You're probably right," agreed Sarah comfortably, "but it will be worth it." She took a large bite and sighed blissfully. Lorna regarded Sarah's bulging cheeks with disgust. "May we go back to bed now?" she asked hopefully. "When I've eaten this," Sarah said with some difficulty, speaking out of the side of her mouth. "If you're feeling cold, we can sit in Dad's study. He always has a fire halfway up the chimney, so I'm sure it won't have burnt out yet." It hadn't. In fact, the firelight was so bright they didn't bother to put the room light on, but curled up on the thick furry rug, and, while Sarah contentedly ate her cake, Lorna warmed her icy toes. "If only I didn't like sweet things, it would be so easy to diet," sighed Sarah between mouthfuls. "You won't tell Irene about this little indiscretion, will you?" Lorna didn't answer. She was gazing intently at a life-size portrait of a young and very beautiful lady holding a red rose in her hand. The portrait was on the wall opposite the fireplace, and in the flickering light the painting looked most lifelike. "Isn't she beautiful?" exclaimed Lorna. "Who is she?" "Her name was Rhoda, which is Greek for rose," replied Sarah. "During her lifetime she kept vases of roses in her room all summer long, and always wore a rose-scented perfume." "Was she a relation of yours?" "Wish she had been," sighed Sarah. "Then I might have inherited some of her beauty. On the other hand, knowing my luck, I would probably have inherited her vile temper instead." "Did she have a vile temper?" Lorna studied the sweetly smiling face. "I find that hard to believe." "So did my grandfather, Henry Parker," sniffed Sarah. "He met Rhoda Marston when she was 18. They met at a hunt ball, and he fell head over heels in love with her. At first he refused to believe the stories he was told about her temper, but it wasn't long before he found out for himself. Henry had arranged to go riding with Rhoda, but had to cancel this when his mother asked him to act as a host in his father's absence. Henry explained this problem to Rhoda, but she insisted he should keep his date with her." "What happened?" asked Lorna. "What didn't happen?" Sarah rolled her eyes dramatically. That evening, when Henry and his mother were seated with their guests at dinner, they heard a horse galloping. It was Rhoda, riding at breakneck speed across the lawn. When she reached the terrace, she halted the sweating beast and shouted for Henry. The French windows to the dining room were open, it being a hot night, and she could see Henry sitting at the table. Henry's youngest sister, Claire, was present at the dinner party, and she wrote a full account of the affair in her diary. "That's how we know all about it," said Sarah, fortifying herself with the last mouthful of cake. When Rhoda shouted for him, Henry turned very white, but continued to entertain his guests. Rhoda grew more and more angry, and, you'll never believe this, she actually rode her horse up the terrace steps and in through the open French doors. Imagine it! She actually rode into the dining room. Rhoda's horse, Magic, reared and pranced before the astonished diners, while Rhoda, her long hair cascading wildly around her shoulders, struck at Henry with her riding whip. "Poor Henry!" exclaimed Lorna. Sarah nodded. Claire wrote that he behaved magnificently. In spite of the danger from the horse's hooves, to say nothing of the whip, he caught hold of Magic's bridle and tried to soothe the frightened creature. Rhoda was furious. She screamed at Henry to leave her horse alone, and struck him again. The horse reared and bumped against the table, knocking several wine glasses to the floor. The glasses were part of a family heirloom. Rhoda knew this and laughed with pleasure. She cried, "I'll teach you to break a date with me," then leant forward and swept several more from the table with her whip. Sarah lowered her voice to a stage whisper. And then the most awful thing happened. "What?" gulped Lorna. Rhoda's horse, frightened by the smashing glass, reared suddenly. Rhoda lost her balance and was thrown to the ground, and, the most terrible thing, one of the horse's hooves struck her face, cutting deeply across her left cheek. Rhoda went hysterical. She grabbed a knife from the table and attempted to slash at Henry, but by now the horrified guests had gathered their wits sufficiently to come to his aid. Rhoda was carried screaming from the room and taken home. She was kept under sedation for weeks. "What about her face?" asked Lorna as Sarah paused to lick the last crumbs from her fingers. "Was she badly scarred?" "Hideously so," said Sarah, with an almost ghoulish delight. She refused to go out or allow anyone to visit her. Apart from her family, the only person to see her after the accident was the artist who painted that portrait. "Was that portrait painted after the accident?" asked Lorna. "Yes, that's why she has turned her head so that you can't see the left side of her face. Rhoda heard about a wandering artist. Some say he was a gypsy, but whatever he was, he claimed he could paint a person's soul into their portrait. Rhoda had him paint a portrait of her, and when, a year later, Henry married Isabel Richmond, Rhoda sent him that painting as a wedding present. There's poor taste for you. Poor old Henry married to a plain-looking but sweet-tempered girl, and Rhoda sends him that gorgeous portrait of herself. They say Isabel was very upset, so Henry put the painting in here, and here it has remained ever since." "What happened to Rhoda?" "Oh yes, I nearly forgot to tell you the best bit. After sending Henry that painting, Rhoda killed herself. She plunged a dagger into her heart, and with her dying breath she cursed poor Henry, and vowed he too should meet a violent death. And he did. A year to the day after Rhoda died, Henry was found murdered, in this very room." Lorna gave a gasp of horror and began to shake all over. Sarah regarded her with amusement. "You've never struck me as the nervous type," she observed dryly. "I'm not," Lorna shivered. "I don't know what's the matter with me. Honestly, I don't. I have the most terrible feeling that something awful is going to happen. Tell me, Sarah, who murdered Henry?" Sarah shrugged. "They never found out. Poor Henry was slumped in that chair, a stab wound in his chest. His eyes were wide open and the expression on his face was one of, well, horror, they say. Claire wrote in her diary that she believed she knew who had murdered Henry, but that no one would believe her." "Who did she think it was?" asked Lorna, rising to her feet, her face as white as chalk. "She didn't say," shrugged Sarah. "I think we ought to go back to bed now. Don't you?" Lorna stared up at the portrait. "She did it," she said positively. "She killed Henry." Sarah looked at Lorna in surprise. "You're talking nonsense. Rhoda had been dead a year when it happened. How could she have done it?" Lorna's face was very pale, her body shaking all over. She spoke in small sobs. "Show us how you did it, Rhoda," she gasped. "Show us. I dare you." To Sarah's horror, the painted head moved, turned, and stared down at them. A look of intense hatred shone in the vivid blue eyes, a hatred directed at Lorna. The figure rose and stepped from the frame. Sarah heard the rustle of the stiff silk dress, saw the hideous scar. An overpowering, almost suffocating scent came from the red rose in Rhoda's hand. Terrified, the two girls clung to each other, mesmerised with fear and unable to protect themselves. From the folds of the silken gown, the slim white hand withdrew a small dagger. Menacingly, she advanced towards them, the hand raised, ready to strike. In the shadows of the doorway behind her, a scream rang out. Rhoda swung round and gave a startled cry when she saw Irene standing there. Irene, pale and shaking, continued to scream again and again. Rhoda stared from one twin to the other. The sight of identical girls standing either side of the room seemed to bewilder her, and she backed away. Sarah, jerked into action by the screams, pulled Lorna across the room. Lights were switched on all over the house as disturbed sleepers rose from their beds to investigate the noise. Grabbing the twins, Sarah ran from the study and along the hallway. At the foot of the stairs, they collided with Sarah's father. Trembling, sobbing, they told him what had happened. "Something woke me up," cried Irene. "I found Lorna was not in bed, and I just knew she was in danger somewhere. So I came to look for her." "And if Irene hadn't screamed when she did, Rhoda would have killed us," cried Sarah. "As it was, I nearly died of fright when Rhoda stepped from that picture frame." "This I must see for myself," said Mr. Parker. He strode towards his study, followed, at a safe distance, by the three nervous girls. Switching on the light, he walked in. The girls peered cautiously from the doorway. The portrait was as it had always been. Rhoda Marston gazed gently down, a smile on her lips, a look of innocence in her painted eye. "But I don't understand," exclaimed Sarah. Mr. Parker smiled gently. "When you told Rhoda's story to Lorna, it started her imagination working. Somehow, Lorna made you believe it was possible for a painting to come to life, and then you both let your imagination run riot." "But what about Irene?" persisted Sarah. "She didn't know about Rhoda, yet she saw her." "Telepathy," said Mr. Parker, in that matter-of-fact way of grown-ups. "It's a well-known fact that people, especially twins, can transmit thoughts to each other, even when many miles apart. Lorna imagined the portrait was alive and put the idea into Irene's mind. Now, girls, back to bed. In the morning, Sarah, I would like an explanation as to why you and Lorna were downstairs at all." "So would I," hissed Irene as they trundled upstairs. "What were you two doing anyway?" "Don't tell her, Lorna," said Sarah, brightening considerably as an idea occurred to her. "Let her guess." She beamed upon Irene. "Lorna will send you the answer by telepathy. Imagine the fun we can have." "No thanks," exclaimed Irene. "I've had quite enough imagining for one night." "I suppose we did imagine it all," said Lorna. "I mean, a painting couldn't really come to life, could it?" "I guess not," sighed Sarah. "Pity. It would have made a smashing story to tell the girls at school." Downstairs, in the study, a red rose petal lay unnoticed on the floor beneath the portrait. A rose petal as garden fresh as the day it had been picked. And red roses don't grow in December.